Inescapable. Chapter 3. Frame. He paced about the room in anxious strides. Even with the gun in hand, he didn't feel safe. Something about this place was steadily eating into him. The woman he just met seemed so ready, so eager and prepared for her journey to the kitchen, and it made sense, considering that any normal person would have been so nonchalant. It made more sense when he remembered her time here. She was in this house even longer than he was. He couldn't imagine what she went through, the things she must have seen. Still, it was nice for him to see another face, and a beautiful one at that. Finding a companion in this strange puzzle rekindled his flame. He was starving and thirsty by the time he came here. Knowing where the restroom would be was a plus. Sarah seemed to know the layout of the place, so she would be a key factor in all this. And that was all that mattered. After he got out of here, he couldn't care less about what happened to her. He tapped his foot impatiently and felt the cold surface of the steel cuffs. He looked down at his hands with the bleak interior surrounding him. It made him realize how precarious his situation was. Without the gun, he was defenseless. But she was venturing into unknown territory. There was a good chance that she would be all right, but something deep down led him to believe otherwise. She wanted 30 minutes to retrieve everything from the kitchen, but her time of absence felt far longer. He could only speculate that an hour or so had passed. There were no clocks to keep track. It made him miss his old cell phone and even the irritating alarm clock that would rattle his skull every morning. Time here seemed non-existent. The only signifier he could track was the breaking dawn of morning. But he wasn't even sure if daybreak would ever come. Something deep in his gut made him yearn for the sunlight. "What's taking her so long?" Tom whispered to himself. He stepped towards the door and placed his hand over the knob. It wasn't so long ago that he saw Sarah move through that very same doorway. Out of curiosity, or perhaps boredom, he pressed the knob in. His nerves jerked at how easily it sunk into the door. The second process, though, proved to be more difficult. It took some effort to twist the knob in a counterclockwise direction. It was as if he was fighting against a weight on the other end. He felt a tinge of embarrassment of how easy she made it look. The feeling soon vanished, though, when he heard a faint click. He had unlocked the door. The door slowly swung on its hinges. A succession of creaks traveled down the corridor. His eyes traveled about the hallway, greeting him. To his left was the wooden surface of the wall, and at his right were 3 barred windows that seemed to lead further in. Whatever he could see in that pitch-black expanse was lit up by the small spaces of moonlight. They would be his safe havens. With the gun pointed at the ground, he took a few cautious steps into the darkness. His feet came into contact with the red carpet. The hall was so quiet that he could hear the muffled sounds of his footsteps. It was strange. The room he came from was crusted and decayed from age, but coming into this hallway provided a new feeling. The walls felt smoother, well kept. He recognized portions of end tables and even paintings hanging from the wall. Even the carpet seemed to be recently cleaned. The paintings and other furnishings were perfectly straightened, no signs of tilting or exposed edges. It made him imagine how inviting it would look in the daylight. He stopped for a moment to admire the painting next to him. It was a framed portrait of a man wearing a white wig. Whatever details you could make out, they were extravagant and marked down to near perfection. Whoever painted the piece was not only skilled, but kept every part of the work neat and organized. He had never admired artwork before, but in fact, he thought it was unnecessary. Only the rich could afford to own such luxuries. The picture frame was made of solid gold, after all. He knew valuables when he saw them. He would have stolen such a rare find if not for the handcuffs. And yet it made him wonder, what was this artwork doing here? Why was it here of all places? And who could possibly construct a home with such contrasting rooms? What drove someone to build such a house? Those questions lingered in the back of his mind as he stared at the portrait. He didn't know why he was so entranced, so intensely drawn to its subtle beauty and sophistication. It was as if he was being sucked into something he knew nothing about. The longer he stared, the more he realized just how still the room was. The wind outside had fallen deathly silent. It was so quiet he could hear a pin drop, even to the very end of the hall. He averted his attention for a moment, gazing down into that chilling space ahead. Realizing that nothing was there, he brought his view back to the painting. Then he looked back once more and shifted his gaze back to the painting again. He couldn't deny the growing sense of uncertainty. He brought himself back to the portrait once more. Then his ears picked up something across the narrow stretch of room. It was such a faint sound. The sound wouldn't have drawn attention if someone wasn't listening. He turned his head towards the noise. "Someone there?" he called out. His voice left no echo in that corridor. He waited and hoped that someone would reply in the moments that passed, but once again that unsettling silence crept its way back to him. He took a few more steps across the floor. He didn't want to stay shrouded any longer, so he carefully inched his way towards the next available light source. The lighted space was so small in comparison to the black voids. He raised his weapon and aimed into that dark space that emanated no sound. "Sarah?" He breathed out warm air as he called her name. He stared into the hallway's end with his narrowed eyes. But no matter how still he stood, nothing responded to his call. "Sarah, is that you?" He called out to her once again. He gripped the gun's handle with such pressure that he thought his fingers would go numb. "Sarah, if this is your idea of a joke, it isn't funny," he said as the weapon shook in his hands. "I'm serious! Knock it off!" He nearly dropped the gun when he heard something planting its foot across the ground. What shook him, though, wasn't the action, but how firmly it stepped onto the floorboards. Even with the carpet cushioning the sound, the vibration could be felt throughout the entire hallway. He could feel the pressure making its way to his legs and deep into his core. Whatever was looking back at him had weight. "I'm warning you, stay back!" he shouted down the hall. The muscles in his arms tensed. He pointed the muzzle at whatever was concealed beyond his vision. His face cringed when he heard another step. "Back away or I'll shoot!" He held his weapon, hoping that his fake courage would deter whatever was lurking in those shadows. His rigid stance fell apart, though, when it took another heavy step. Any person would have been afraid of a man with a gun, but whatever was creeping its way towards him wasn't. Its gait was steady, firm, and solid in comparison to his feeble steps. He stepped back when he felt the presence drawing closer. Whatever he couldn't see was responding with his movement. He kept his eyes focused while retreating to the safety of a light space. He kept his progression back, slow, methodical. He tried his best not to slip on the carpet, but at the same time couldn't keep his eyes straight. Tom stopped when he heard its steps come to an abrupt halt. He held his breath at that moment. What could possibly have stopped its tread? When he looked down, he saw a lighted space in front of him. He breathed out in a mixture of uneasiness and relief. He lowered his weapon and took another step back. His feeling of safety, however, was short-lived. The light in front of him began to fade. From the window, he saw the clouds covering the moon with their dense material. Whatever light remained was soon consumed by darkness. And it was then that the primal urge truly hit in. "Run!" He sprinted for the door he came through, his body banged harshly against the wooden frame before grabbing the knob. He didn't want to drop the gun, so he desperately clawed the metal piece with his other hand. The knob was stuck. "Oh shit!" he muttered beneath his panicked breath. He tried to twist the knob as best he could. No amount of effort moved it even an inch. He looked back. The steps behind him grew louder, and soon enough, he could hear something even more terrifying than the stomps across the floor. He could hear breathing. "Shit! Oh God, open up!" As a last act, he plunged himself into the door. The action harmed him more than Frame as it sent him down to the ground. Tom picked himself up and tried again, but nothing worked. He turned when he felt the warm breath against his back. He planted himself against the door. It didn't take long for the light to die out. He closed his eyes the moment the room became devoid of sight. His heart was racing. He could feel the beads of sweat forming across his face. His skin stung, which made his eyes twitch and struggle to stay open. He didn't blink. He wouldn't dare blink after what he just felt. He brought the gun up and tried to steady his hands. He could hear himself panting, hyperventilating even from the sheer stress that was penetrating his body. His hands became moist and his legs shook. Whatever was stepping through the hallway had suddenly become quiet. The air around him dropped in temperature, becoming more frigid by the second and stiffening his limbs. It made his throat run dry. His pupils shrank. The adrenaline was pumping through him in rapid currents. Tom found his fingers squeezing down on the trigger. He didn't know what he was doing. The only thing that drove him to pull the trigger was a fright beyond anything he had ever felt. And then a shot rang out, followed by a hot shell that fell to the floor. The darkness that consumed his vision was briefly lit. His eardrums nearly split at the overpowering sound. He forgot how loud guns were in confined spaces. The noise and kickback of the weapon nearly made him fall over. The shot felt like a flashbang and left him with a pounding headache. He caught a short glimpse of that stretch of room as if it were lit in pure daylight. But it was a thing at the end of the hallway that truly chilled him. It was only a brief second, but he could see something standing there. He heaved over and sucked in as much air as he could. It came as alleviation when the clouds moved beyond the moon. Once again, the light shined through the windows. He felt at ease when the presence had left the room. He gave his ears some time to recover and attempted to push the knob in. To his surprise, the knob had suddenly complied. He smirked and looked back at his weapon. 4 bullets left, he said as he examined the magazine. He didn't know why the door had decided to allow him entrance, but he no longer cared. He was just glad the event was over. Sarah, I've got to find her, he stuttered. He gritted his teeth and mustered up whatever bravery he could. After what he had just experienced, he knew he didn't want to go through with it. But Sarah was a ticket to getting out of this hellhole. He had to find her and make sure she was all right, or run the risk of waiting inside of this place like she did. He knew he wouldn't last long if that happened. So he stepped down that dark corridor once again, dreading each and every sound that came from his feet. He had to put up a barrier to keep his sanity in check. Every time he moved from light to dark, he could feel coldness moving down his spine. He treaded from safety to possible death to safety, back to peril. It was more than unnerving for his mind. The feeling brought him back to his early childhood. His father would derive amusement from telling him ghost and monster stories before bedtime. And every time he got up to use the restroom, he found himself reluctant. Every room, every corner, and every crack made his imagination run wild. He didn't want to know what lied in those shadows, in the closet, and under his bed. And he would ask his father every time whether or not such nightmarish creatures existed. As a child, he found himself confused when no answer came. Back then, he didn't know what was worse, being told the truth, lied to, or being left to wonder. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real, Tom, he whispered to himself. He had to keep his mind away from the subject. He had to convince himself that nothing was ever there, that he was hallucinating. Amidst his travel down the hallway, his thoughts shifted back to his therapy sessions. He went to Dr. Jones' office when he was experiencing things that didn't make sense. He told him he felt someone pressing down on him every time he tried to wake up. That he heard disembodied voices whispering into his ear the moment before he opened his eyes. He told him that something was giving him nightmares every night. It was beginning to affect his relationship with others. The sweet doctor assured him that everything was fine. That many people before have felt such strange things. things that disobeyed the boundaries of logic. He told them it was completely natural, that he was under lots of stress and simply had to keep his lifestyle habits more low-key. Tom felt so happy after that. Nothing ever woke him in a state of panic or sweat. His mind was finally free for so many years. He had finally gotten his life back together. Tom opened his eyes to be met with the cold, harsh reality in front of him. His shoe met a slick surface on the floor, and he stopped the moment his nose picked up a familiar scent. He kneeled down and placed his fingers over the substance. He rubbed it and took a quick waft of its scent. There was no mistaking it. "Blood," he remarked. What brought tension to his shoulders was how fresh it was. No longer able to contain his curiosity, he strode down the remainder of the hallway and felt the surface of the wall at the very end. It was perfectly smooth, meaning the bullet never hit any part of it. He only fired in this direction, so there should have been a bullet hole somewhere. Did I hit something? Tom questioned. He turned to see the other end of the hallway. The last portion of it extended down to the left where the door awaited. He made his way to the knob, pushed and twisted counterclockwise. It swung open easily, and he closed the door behind him. He could barely believe his eyes. He was staring at the kitchen. It was only a room apart from the entrance he came from. He shook his head and felt so much shame for taking this long to find it. Like the entrance room, the kitchen itself was starting to rot. The wood beneath his feet felt frail enough for someone to fall through. The tableware and utensils were rusted and covered in dirt. Everything before him was a mess, especially the refrigerator, which looked to be ransacked. Whoever was here had apparently cleaned out. "She must have already left," he said. "Still, surprised the refrigerator could be working down here. Is there electricity in this house?" He sifted through the contents on the floor. His hands felt through wrappers and plastic, mostly potato chip bags amongst other things. She did a thorough job in taking everything. "I've got to ask her where the fuse box is. We're going to need light." He saw another door. She must have exited that way and not the way he came. Nevertheless, he didn't have the stomach to brave another strange encounter, so he decided to go back to the familiar route. Not wanting to stay in that dreary atmosphere anymore, he opened the door and came through, hoping to meet the finer surroundings of the hallway. But what he saw made him shudder. What the fuck? The walls were crusted and torn as if some wild animal had its way with them ages ago. You could make out scratches everywhere and stains from an unknown origin splattered against the corner of the room. Spaces once filled with end tables and paintings had become eerily vacant. The windows were no longer polished or clean, but cracked and smeared with dust. "I just came through this place," he said, shaking his head. "What the hell happened?" He decided to let it go and made his way back to the entrance room. His feet met an unfamiliar texture on the ground. The soft carpeting was no longer there, so every step he made produced a creak. It was as if the floorboards beneath him were suffering under his weight. His foot splashed into a small puddle. The blood was still there. He forced his body to push on and came back to the same door that gave him so much trouble. It allowed him to enter, but he stopped the moment before he could step through. There was something that he couldn't ignore, something deeply etched into the wall, letters that he never saw before. He could barely make out what they were trying to say in the dark, but it was then that the idea hit him. He still had the officer's badge. Tom stepped back from the doorway and into the light. He pulled the badge out from his pocket and let the light bounce off. It made a temporary flashlight, but he had to concentrate to make sure the light beam was strong and steady. The letters were finally revealed. Tom stood there in silence as he stared at the words. "Help me."